Hello, I'm Tammy Shiambade, Houston-based attorney and host of Ask Tammy Live. Today's question of the day is LLC versus corporation. Which one should I choose for my business? I'm going to give you the standard lawyer answer. It depends, because it really does depend. There are unique characteristics of both of these different types of entities that really impact which one you should choose. So what I would like to do is tell you the similarities between the two and then the differences, so you understand where that overlap might occur and then know where you really need to pay attention in terms of, does this fit my business? So LLCs, which are limited liability companies, and corporations are both types of legal entities for business. They're business legal structures recognized by your state, saying, hey, this is one way to create a separate personality, a separate business, and here's another way to create a separate personality / business. So they're both legal business structures. Okay, that's the first thing you should know. The second thing that you should keep in mind is that both LLCs and corporations provide you limited liability. If you don't remember what limited liability is, essentially it means that what's at risk is only what the business has to put. So if you were to get into any type of trouble, if you were to be sued for some reason, your personal assets will not be on the line because your liability is limited in the business, limited to what the business has. Okay? So that's a characteristic that both your LLCs and your corporations have. All right, the third similarity I'd like to share with you is that both of these require you to file something with your state Secretary of State. So for example, in Texas, you have to file something with the Texas Secretary of State in order to create an LLC or in order to create a corporation. I've come in contact with some people who have thought that, hey, maybe when they're getting their tax ID number and they file something with the IRS, that creates an LLC or corporation. No, you have to create these with your state government. Those are three ways that these entities are similar. You have to file something, right? They both provide limited liability and they're both actual entities, right? They're different from like our sole proprietorships, right? Or our DBAs that we were talking about. Right? This is a legal formal structure. All right, so now that we've spoken about some of the major similarities, I want to go into the differences. The first difference I want to talk to you about is about naming. All right, when you are creating an LLC, you have to make sure that your name ends with either LLC or limited liability company or limited. There are actual statutory, that means like regulations, provisions as to what needs to be at the end of your business name when you're an LLC. The same can be said for the corporation, but not the exact same. You cannot call a corporation a limited liability company. You cannot end your corporation with LLC. You can end your corporation's name with Inc., like incorporated or corporation. You're allowed to do that because you're actually dealing with a corporation, right? You're actually incorporating something. A lot of times I hear some overlap. Some people think that they can call their LLCs corporations or end their names with Inc. That's not allowed. Inc. is reserved for your corporations, LLC for your LLCs. So that's the first place where they differ. If you like the formal sound of corporation, then you already know what area you're leaning toward. But there is more to consider. Beyond just the way that they differ in terms of naming, they differ in terms of ownership structure. First of all, owners are called members in LLCs. And then in terms of what they own, a lot of times they're described as membership interests. When we're talking about corporations, right, the owners of a corporation are called shareholders. And the interest, the parts of that business structure are called shares. That's why you have shareholders, right? So shares and shareholders. Now, it's usually easier, more flexible to buy and sell corporate shares than it is for LLC membership interests. It's not impossible, but people who want a lot of flexibility in terms of buying and sharing parts of their business usually lean towards the corporate side. This is especially important if you're someone who's interested in seeking investors. A lot of the big investors and venture capitalists only look to people who have corporations. So if that's something that you're considering, that's where you want to kind of place your focus, right? LLCs are for structures that don't necessarily require as much flexibility in terms of ownership. Smaller businesses tend to kind of favor the LLC structure in that regard, because it's harder to sell your interests. It's based off of the percentage that you own, not necessarily shares that you own. Okay? That's another difference. We talked about naming, now we're talking about ownership, right? So another area where we find a difference between your LLC and your corporation is in terms of management, right? So there are requirements in terms of how you manage your different entities. And these might differ slightly from state to state because these are all creations of state law. But essentially, when you're dealing with an LLC, when it comes to management, a lot of times you have the option of having the member, remember that's the owner, manage the day-to-day functions, or you can decide to have managers manage things. It's a question that a lot of the states make you answer when you're forming your entity. So if you think that you might be forming a business that you're going to have someone else manage for you, the LLC provides that type of structure where you can do that. But a lot of times with LLCs, what you'll find is that the members, the owners, are also the people who manage it. And in many instances, they want to retain that power to do so. Now, when you talk to a lawyer, sometimes we can do certain things to kind of protect your interest, where we might create certain structures that are unique for you, but we're not going to get into the weeds today. The basics are, with an LLC, you can have a member manage it or you can have another manager manage it. That's the option that's provided. Now, when we're talking about the corporations, you have your shareholders. Remember, those are your owners, but you are required to have a board of directors and officers, right? So these are like 3 tiers of people who are decision makers regarding the company, all right, or regarding the corporation. You have your shareholders who own it, who make big decisions about who the directors are. Your board of directors help with the vision that has been cast from the shareholders and kind of move the company, move the corporation in that direction, all right? And then you have the officers who kind of execute the day-to-day functions. So that's when you get your CEOs, right? Or your COOs or your CTOs. So Chief Executive Officer, Chief Operational Officer, Chief Technology Officer, all these different C-somethings. Your C-suite, those are officers. Your directors, they get to manage kind of like, okay, this is where we're steering this ship. So there's a more complex management structure when we're talking about corporations that are required by law. Okay? So we've talked about the naming differences. We've talked about the ownership differences. We've talked about the management differences. Now, let's talk about the requirements on a regular basis. When we're talking about LLCs, LLCs provide a large amount of flexibility. So in terms of your ongoing requirements, you might not necessarily have as many requirements as you would as a corporation. In many states, they might make you file an annual report where you keep the state up to date and say, hey, this is what we have going on. These are our officers at this time, or these are the people who are in charge. You might have to file some type of report in that regard. But there are not many other things that are required. If you want more requirements, oftentimes you have to build those into the contracts that you make as an LLC. Things like your company agreement or your operating agreement can put some more teeth in terms of the requirements that you have in your company. With a corporation, on the other hand, right, you have more requirements usually. So the corporation will require that you have a certain number of meetings each year, at least one annual meeting. You're going to have to make sure you have that reporting oftentimes. There's a way that you have to document where you keep your books, the records of the company. You have to have certain things in place where people have access to review the records of the company. There are all of those things that come into play when we're talking about the corporation. So in terms of that, it's more rigid. Now, what you should understand is that when it's time to analyze, let's say, your liability for an issue, they're going to hold you to that standard that has been established for the corporation. And if you haven't followed the rules that are outlined, those requirements, you can lose your limited liability protection. You can lose your corporate structure. And so that's why it's really important to understand that this might be, the corporation might be more complex, might be a more complex entity to choose. So we've spoken about what naming, we've spoken about ownership, we've spoken about management, right? And we've spoken about ongoing requirements. Now, one of the big ones is also taxes. The way that your LLC is taxed is very flexible. This is because from a federal level, not a state level, but a federal level, the federal government has not yet recognized the LLC and given it its own unique tax structure. So what does that mean? That means based off of how many owners you have and what you decide as an owner, you get to almost choose the way you want to be taxed as an LLC. There are some limitations to that, but essentially if an LLC wants to be taxed as a sole proprietorship, it can be. If it wants to be taxed as a partnership and it has multiple members, it can be. If it wants to be taxed as a corporation, it can be. If it wants to be taxed as an S-Corp, it can be. There are ways to get those things, so it's flexible. And then additionally, an LLC is also taxed on one level unless you opt for it to be taxed differently. And what do I mean? It might be easier to explain that if we now bounce to the corporate side. When we're talking about corporations and how they are taxed, corporations are taxed twice. The corporation entity is taxed on one level, and then the owner of the corporation is taxed. So that means your corporation has to file its own tax forms, right? You have to get someone to prepare tax forms on behalf of the corporation. And then your own personal taxes, you have to do the same. This is called a double tax, and it's a landmark characteristic of your corporation. However, your LLC does not have that. Your LLC has something called a pass-through taxation. So the entity, the LLC, does not have to file its own taxes. It's filed, the taxes are paid from you as an owner reporting your profits. Okay. Now again, there's flexibility. There are things that happen depending on what you choose, and that's really a question that you want to sit down and ask a tax professional to kind of help you analyze the best way to organize it. But LLC provides you that flexibility, and corporations not so much. I will add a caveat to that, and that's that corporations can also choose to be taxed as S corporations, because essentially S corporations are not a separate type of entity. If you're curious about what I mean by that, there's another video. I'll put a link to it below. But there's that. So just keep that in the back of your mind. But corporation double tax, LLC pass-through taxation. And so we've spoken about all these different things, but essentially what you should know is that LLCs provide more flexibility, corporations not so much. However, if you're looking for investors like that there isn't as much flexibility because it makes them feel better about the risk that they're taking. So they opt for corporations. Whereas if you're a small business and you just want that flexibility to be able to build your thing, build your baby out yourself, the LLC might provide that structure for you. Again, this is really an individual determination. There are other factors that come into play: what type of business you're owning, the industry that you're in, what your financial situation looks like. These are all factors that will feed into whether you do an LLC or a corporation. But I wanted to give you an overall picture between the two. So I don't have an exact answer for you. Sometimes someone comes into my office and I say, hey, we should do an LLC. Sometimes someone comes in, I'm like, hey, you should do a corporation. It really does depend. So I hope that this has been helpful to you. If it has been, go ahead and subscribe below, because I'm trying to provide some basic information to help you become an informed business owner. And then if you have any questions of me, feel free to reach out to me. You can follow me on social. My handle is @TOSLegal, and that's on Twitter, that's on Instagram, that's on Facebook, right? Reach out to me. And then you can also visit our website, www.toslegal.com, for more information about the ways that our firm helps small business owners. That is all I have for you today. I hope that this has been helpful. Have a great day. Take it easy. Bye.